Okay, so um, welcome to another edition of Jews and the News. For those watching who might not have been familiar with Jews and the News before, but are watching because the name Ariel Dunat came up in your algorithm on YouTube and looking for a recording to watch, then Jews in the News is a class that I've been doing at Sha'arei Tefillah since COVID, and we've gone on Zoom for classes to discuss events in the news from a Jewish perspective. I had arranged with the Jewish Theological Seminary, which is the academic institution of the conservative movement in New York City. Most famously known for, I guess more popularly known for its rabbinical school. It's where my father was ordained, it's where I was ordained, and it's where our guest tonight, Ariel Dunat, is a student. Ariel, you might remember, was with us in November, and the seminary has a student ambassador program, and I had arranged with them for a student to be with us twice this year. So this is the second time for Ariel to be with us. Ariel is from Dayton, Ohio, originally, has been in rabbinical school now, and we had arranged for Ariel to talk this evening just about about rabbinical school now and the students who are there and challenges facing the conservative movement going forward. So, Ariel, if you unmute yourself, you can take it away.
Hey everyone. So yeah, just talking about rabbinical school. It's been a journey. It's been 5 years now that I've been through it. And so I've gotten to see a lot of shifts and a lot of changes over these 5 years. I started my first year was during COVID, and so we were fully on Zoom that entire first year. My second year we were back in person, thank God, but it was all masked and it was a whole balagan of that. And then my third year was my Israel year, which was actually pushed off from my second year because of COVID. And then coming back after our Israel year, we then saw the difficulties and the challenges after October 7th in the war, and wrapping up now my fifth year and looking forward towards the future. Um,
Are you graduating or do you have
in 10 days, I will be ordained.
Mazel Tov on that and Yasher Koach? And can you, before you continue with your talk, do you know what you're doing after you graduate?
Sadly, not of yet, but God willing soon.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think there's a few points that I wrote down just that I think are important to think about JTS nowadays as it had been in the past. So I think one point being is that the student body is a lot more diverse than it has been in historical periods. That nowadays, not only in addition to ordaining men and women, we are now also ordaining people who are openly LGBTQA, people who are gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual. We're also seeing an increase in students who have different forms of diversity, people from different backgrounds, Jewishly, people who grew up very observant, people who grew up a lot more secular, people who have a lot more people who have converted into Judaism, seeing people who have really come into Judaism in different routes and different ways, but also seeing people with different neurodiverse backgrounds, people who have autism, people who are disabled in other various forms. And so we're really seeing an increase in the amount of diversity in what the student body is actually looking like and where they're coming from. And I think that is I think it's a blessing, and I think it is a beautiful thing to give to the Jewish people going forth, and a really good representation of what the Jewish world actually looks like. But it does bring challenges. Another point is that the graduating classes are smaller than they used to be. I believe Rabbi Gordon Tucker, one of my mentors, when he was in rabbinical school at JTS, I think he said that his cohorts were about 50 students each year. And so each year they would graduate about 50 students each year. And I believe subsequently after that, some of my other teachers said they were during the cohorts when it was about 30 people, and then people were about 20. And now we're averaging, I'd say, somewhere between 10 and 15 people graduating each cohort. So we've seen a significant less amount of students coming. I will also say that we do have a second rabbinical school compared to back when my my mentor Rabbi Tucker was in. Ziegler is now a school as well. My understanding is they are ordaining less than JTS, but that's always been a norm. I think this year they're ordaining 4 students, whereas JTS is ordaining 9 students this year. And so and that's roughly consistent. I think that it's historically been about half-ish of what JTS's number has been. Um, and the other point I have is that there's an increasing amount of people who are going into roles that are not the pulpit. Historically, the pulpit was the mainstay, and it still is. I think the RA statistics show that I think about 50-ish% of rabbis end up going to the pulpit role, but it used to be much higher. It used to be, I think, somewhere closer to 80-ish%. And now we're seeing a lot of people go into fields in social justice, nonprofit work. We're seeing a lot of people in chaplaincy, a lot of people in Jewish education, and we're just seeing a larger diversification of what a rabbi can be, but still with a heavy emphasis on pulpit. So I think those are the 3 biggest things I've seen about the student body. Um,
Can I ask you a couple questions about that before we go on?
of
And
course,
if anybody else has a question, you can also either raise your hand or just unmute and ask. So I actually have a question about each one of these points that you brought up. So I'm just going to use myself as the example, and I was ordained in in 1989, and my entering class in 1984, I guess for 1984 was diverse because it was the first year that women were allowed in.
mhm,
But I don't think it had the challenges that you brought up in terms of background. That is, it was expected that people coming in would have enough of a background in Hebrew
mhm,
and some basic understanding of rabbinic texts so that diving into the curriculum, which was heavily text-based and assuming a particular level of knowledge of Hebrew. The curriculum itself and the expectations were that there wasn't diversity in terms of ability, academic ability. There was, and the only diversity was male and female students. So what you hinted that there was a challenge to this, the extreme, not extreme, but in terms of the multifaceted diversity of the student body. What do you see as the challenges of LGBTQ? You said secular, people who converted, neurodiverse, etc. What do you think the challenges are?
I think the challenges come out of just where people are. There's a wide range of where everyone falls in their tech skills, their knowledge of Jewish prayer and holiday observance, and so I think that's where the challenges really come up. Is that especially in the text, because JTS is still very much an academic text-based university, albeit a lot less than my Rabbi Tucker, I believe, when he was being ordained or admitted into school, they had to learn, I think, several chapters of Talmud basically by heart.
Mm,
Whereas when we were admitted into JTS, we just had a short section of Talmud that we had to work with the rabbi in translation.
mhm,
But I think text skill is a big one. So we see a lot of times now at JTS, especially with Talmud and Halacha, with the codes courses on Jewish law, that they're often broken up into levels. And so there's an upper level, usually a middle level, and a lower level.
mhm,
And we're seeing that there's a lot more challenges arising out of that, that
mhm,
there are still a large amount of students who do a gap year either and do a yeshiva year, or they grew up going to a Jewish day school, so they learned Talmud as a child and sort of just learn how to do that younger, or people who are just other reasons or another have higher tech skills. But there are a lot of people who are coming in with not as much familiarity with the text, especially with Talmud and halachic texts. And so they're coming in with some knowledge. JTS does require that most people have at least a basic foundation understanding, but still it brings in challenges that when we're trying to make classes, especially as we see smaller cohort sizes, that it's harder we're seeing some years where when they have a smaller cohort, that it is harder to have the upper, middle, and lower levels
mhm.
having a lower and an upper, and then there's a lot of those people who really would be in a middle level and
Hmm.
benefit from having a quicker pace, but not too quick of a pace, and
Hmm.
having a bit less focus on like the specifics of the grammar, but having some grammar focus. And so we're seeing a lot of people who are being either put into an upper level that's too challenging for them, or
Hmm.
a lower level that is not enough of a challenge for them.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's the same thing with Hebrew skills. Hebrew skill, I think it used to be that most people were coming into JTS, not maybe not fluent in Hebrew, but having high proficiency in Hebrew, be able ability to speak and have conversational Hebrew skills. And nowadays, a lot of people are coming in and what are doing what we call remedial Hebrew, where they do a crash course basically before they officially start rabbinical school to do essentially a year or two's worth of Hebrew skills to really get them up to snuff so that way they can feel comfortable enough working with the texts.
Hmm. Hmm. So another thing about this diversity, I wonder when I entered, it was an expectation that all the students were fully observant of halakha. And I'm not embarrassed to say that the dean of the rabbinical school at the time when I had my preliminary interview, Rabbi Joel Roth, said to me at the end of the interview, I urge you to be more punctilious in your observance.
Mhm.
And so there's that expectation that people are observant of halakha based on whatever definition of observant of halakha means.
Mhm.
But I'm wondering what if there's an expectation of Jewish observance among the student body today.
I think that the way I've heard this expressed, we've had, so I will caveat this with that in my time at JTS, we've had three separate deans. I came in under Rabbi Nevins, who was the dean for many, many years at JTS prior to me, and he left after my first year. And then we had an interim dean with Rabbi Urbach, and we have now have the deanship under Rabbi Cohen. And so we're seeing some changes in the leadership structure and what they're expecting, but I think I've seen a shift from when I was my first year with Rabbi Nevins. I think he was the last residual amount of expectations and
Mm.
you have to hold this. And I think there's a shift now towards we have an expectation that you'll come to this place, but during the years of JTS, this is a time for exploration and a time for growing and curiosity, but not any specific firm expectations. So a challenge I've witnessed is I'm one of the Gabbayim in the synagogue at JTS in Willis, the Women's League Seminary Synagogue, and we no longer have we have a technically official requirement for coming to davening and being present in the minyan, but it's largely not enforced. And as such, we have seen at JTS largely on Mondays, we don't get a minion anymore.
Wow. Wow.
Most of the other days we get a minion,
Uh-huh.
and that's a combination of factors, I will say. But
Yeah, not everybody lives around there and they're commuting,
a lot
but
of people are coming back in over the weekends from pulpits out of town, but
right.
it is still a struggle to get a minion, even
Wow.
counting the people who are there for their job.
Right.
But
Right. That's fascinating.
well,
Okay.
kashrut is a big debate with the student body that for example, I keep what's called hechsher kosher. I follow a very strict approach to keeping kosher where everything is certified kosher.
Right.
And then within the conservative movement, there are opinions on what does and does not need. And
Hmm.
that is a normative approach. But there are students who are taking a much more liberal approach to kashrut. And as such, there's a lot of conflict between students like me and students who have a much more liberal approach where we a lot of the times not eat in each other's houses.
Wow. 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 Okay. I'll let that sit for a little while as you go on with whatever what else you want to say.
Uh, but I think what is coming out of it is a greater focus on trying to use the years of being in JTS to really explore and find what feels comfortable. I think there had been a environment in which it felt very much that if you don't meet this like threshold, you're not religious enough and you're not
Hmm.
from enough. And so a lot of people felt that was very daunting, I think, that if
Hmm.
that specific standard, they would be ostracized a bit. And so I think one of the good things that is coming out of it, albeit I do have my personal caveats, I think is that it does allow for people to explore, that people
Hmm.
come in and they might down the road, once they're a rabbi, once they're a cantor, keep a certain level of kashrut in their home and in their community. But during their years at JTS, they might go from when they live in the Israel year, especially a lot of people keep very strict kosher because it's a lot easier to do so in Israel. But
Hmm.
when they're back in New York, they might be a bit more permissive about eating out in a vegan or vegetarian restaurant or allowing vegan, vegetarian foods that don't have a kosher symbol, but accepting them as kosher with just the vegan or the
Hmm.
vegetarian. And a lot of people really take that time to play around and see what, especially within the conservative movement, we do have several opinions on things like cheeses and wine,
Hmm.
uh,
Hmm. Hmm.
about whether they need to be certified or not. And so a lot of people do take that time to play with various levels of observance, especially around Shabbat and prayer observance. And I think that is a really good thing that people take the time to really, what does it mean to them as an individual? What does it mean to have a practice as an individual and live in a community and try to
Hmm.
find a balance between those things?
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, very good. Um, all right, I think you were also going to comment about, so what does all this mean for the future of the movement?
Yes. I think the biggest thing I'm seeing is that there is a struggle with identity. I think as we're seeing, especially with this vast diversity of people who are coming in, a lot of people who have not come out of conservative backgrounds, especially have never their childhood shul was either reform or just they didn't go to shul as a child, and they're coming in without a background or an affiliation with the conservative movement. And so we're seeing, I think, this identity crisis in a shul
Hmm.
that the movement is really coming to grasp with what does it mean to be a halachic movement? Does it mean that we fully hold ourselves to be bound by halacha? Or is it more that halacha is important and inspiring and meaningful, and we should strive to uphold it as we are able, but it is suggestive more than requiring. So I think that is a big part, is that there's this identity crisis. I think also around topics about matrilineality, about who is a Jew based off of birth. Is it just through the mother, or is it possibly off the father? There's an increasing, I think, push among some students to see patrilineality as also a form of Jewish descent. There's also the interfaith debate has made its way into JTS as well, and there's an increasing number of students who are, if not pushing for the permission to do intermarriages, at least pushing to have a bigger discussion about it than historically we've had at JTS. And so identity, I think, and then certainly there's the big one, especially in our day, especially post October 7th, is the topic of Zionism and what does it mean to be a Zionist? What does it mean to be a movement that is a Zionist and an institution? JTS being an institution that is a Zionist organization, and have students who do who openly identify as anti or non-Zionists. And I think that is a big discussion that we're having right now.
Hmm. So, is there a discussion about that there should be like a litmus test for incoming students? Like we only accept those students who are Zionist, or is there an argument just as loud to say no, there shouldn't be any kind of litmus test?
Mhm. So the way that they do it with the admissions process is that it's essentially an ongoing conversation, that they want the person to have a relationship with Israel, even if it is a bit more tense, but they want them to have a relationship with Israel, with the Jewish state, with the Jewish people, and to have that be similar to other topics, be an involving and ongoing conversation.
Mhm.
So there are students who have come in and throughout their admission process are very vocal that they specifically are not a Zionist. And it's been a conversation that we've had, but that I would say by and far that's not a large amount of students. There's only a handful of students who very specifically identify as anti-Zionist. There's a decent amount of people who I think are what I would call Zionist apathetic, that they would not necessarily not identify as a Zionist, but for them, Zionism is just less of a personal concern.
Mhm.
And so I think it's much less of a litmus test and more of a ongoing conversation. I think if there were students who were very much like anti-Zionist coming into the application process and just like, I will not go to the Israel year, I will not engage in this conversation, that I think would be too far for JTS. But I
Uh,
think as long as the person is open to having ongoing vulnerable conversations, they're willing to take them.
So I'm curious about these ongoing conversations that you're referring to, because again, when I was in rabbinical school, there weren't ongoing conversations. I had a conversation with the dean for a preliminary interview to tell me whether I can apply or not. And then I applied, and then there was a committee that I had to sit in front of to that asked questions about my entrance essays that I had to write about different Jewish issues, and then that committee, plus also a Hebrew exam and a Bible exam, determined whether I got into rabbinical school or not. And then there were no more ongoing conversations unless, you had conversations with your professor about a particular class, but it wasn't like like my year every year would be meeting with a mentor or something like that. That only happened my senior year when Rabbi Bill Lebo was hired to be vice chancellor, and he started to encourage some changes in a rabbinical school. So I'm sorry for that lengthy kind of background, but what does ongoing conversations with the students mean?
I think it's comes in several forms. I think in one part it's a one-on-one ongoing conversation between the actual student and the administration. So I think sometimes it comes up where they just have one-on-one meetings. They talk about how the year went. We're starting to institute a process of what's called a 360 at JTS, where I think it's the end of your second or third year, and then the end of I think it's the second and fourth year. End of your second and fourth year, we do what's called a 360 evaluation where there's a lot of surveys sent out to mentors, to classmates, to colleagues, to bosses, etc. And they fill out a whole slew of questions about rabbinic practice, teaching, education. And we're using this as an opportunity now to have bigger conversations about their rabbinic formation. And so I think in those situations, it's some such, but I think also we're having a lot of these conversations as community. We have part of JTS, we have a weekly community time where we as a rabbinic community come together, have lunch. We often have conversations or guest speakers or guest learning activities, and they often center around these topics. This year we've had a lot of them around Israel, obviously
Hmm.
7th. Historic, we also have had ones around what does it mean to be chayav? What does it mean to be obligated in the mitzvot? And we have conversations about what that looks like. And so I think there's both the one-on-ones with the administration more formal, and then there's also the more open-ended, informal, communal conversations happening.
Okay. Before I get to open it up for other people, so hang on a second, Zella. I wanted to also ask about this connection to the conservative movement and identifying, because you and your classmates are supposed to be the leaders of the conservative movement. And if you're suggesting that the student body, many of the students don't have and didn't grow up in the conservative movement, or don't necessarily care about identifying with, or like rah conservative Judaism, I'm just wondering, is there anything that the seminary is doing, or if the leadership of the Rabbinical Assembly, like Rabbi Jacob Blumenthal or Rabbi Jay Kornskold or others from the RA United Synagogue, come to promote and encourage more of a connection to the conservative movement.
I think certainly the RA leadership does what they do. We have starting first year, but we meet the head of the RA, so Rabbi Blumenthal and various other heads, and they come into the first year seminar, and you're presented with what's called the Moreh Derech, the Rabbi's Manual. And
Mhm,
the beginning of the establishment of a relationship with the RA, where we get this book, which we quite literally will use as rabbis for the rest of our lives to do life cycles and various things. And it's the building of this relationship, and I think that's just the starting point. We then, especially once you hit third, fourth year, when you start really looking towards the after years, we start to have more and more interactions with the RA, where they come into seminar classes, they come in and have one-on-one with the cohort meetings. Or, for example, this year we've, I think, had several times where we have meetings with them just to get to know about each other. We've sit down one-on-one with Rabbi Blumenthal to have in-depth conversations about who we are, what our goals are, and to get to know each other. And for example, I think a few weeks ago, they took all of the senior students out to a dinner so we could just have dinner together and get to know each other, talk about what the future looks like for each of us, and get to build those relationships.
Okay,
Um,
that's good.
I think part of it is I think there's an increasing movement towards post-denomination,
Mhm.
that there's a lot of people who don't have strong affiliations with the movement, or they'll identify tra tr in the trajectory of the movement, but not specifically with it.
Mhm.
That they feel home with it, but they as an individual don't feel attached to the specific label of it. And so I think we're seeing that, especially. I think that's also related to one of the other challenges I think the movement is facing, is that there's just a decrease in numbers. That the conservative movement used to be the largest movement in the United States and I believe in the world, but has shrunk over the years to being the second largest. And with that decrease, there's a less amount of students, as I mentioned. There's less amount of a lot of schools are starting to either merge or to close up. And so I think there's a concern about just numbers, and JTS, in part because of that, is taking more and more students who they may historically not have taken, just to because the school does need to have students to function.
Mhm.
And so I think that reality creates some challenges that come out of it when they do have to accept students that they may have not accepted in the past.
Got it. So it's like a vicious cycle. Yeah. Um, okay. So Zella, you had your hand up, so why don't you unmute? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I was curious that you said that not all the students are necessarily feel strongly about Israel and Zionism. So, my question was, are the students required to spend a year in Israel? And if they do, does it change any of their attitudes when they come back after that year?
Mhm. So we are still required to do a full Israel year. Ziegler is instituting a change in their policy where they're having a intensive summer Israel program rather than a full year, but they're also changing their whole program overall. But JTS still requires the full year. There are some exceptions made for specific cases. So I had a classmate who had their partner had just given birth before the Israel year, so they were exempted from the Israel year because bringing a newborn child would be extremely difficult. But some people also go for a semester if there's a specific challenge or other, but most people are required to do a full year. I would say that I'm thinking specifically my classmates that I'm aware of who went to Israel specifically not having a strong Zionist identity. I think a lot of them, their identity didn't necessarily change as a whole, but I think that the conversation, especially during the Israel year, we have an intensive program where we learn about Zionist history, the history of Israel and the region, the geopolitical situation, and about just the big wigs of Israeli history. And going around Israel, especially to see, especially Masorti conservative communities, and to see just the whole of the country. And I think from that, a lot of people are coming out of Israel, even if their specific politics or identities don't change, having at least a greater appreciation for the complicated conversation that it is, and being more open-minded to at least having those difficult conversations.
Good. Uh, Anybody else with questions? So I'm going to ask about this denominationalism,
Mm.
and that is, I'll ask it this way: what do you think would then be the difference between the JTS program and the Hebrew College program in Boston, or the Academy for Jewish Religion program in New York, and then the new program from Hadar?
Mhm. I think one difference that JTS still firmly holds and holds above the other ones, especially the difference between, I think, HUC, Hebrew Union College Reform Seminary, and JTS, is that we are still very strongly focused on academic texts, and especially with the Talmud and halachic texts. So I think JTS still really holds that leg up on everyone else, is that I think JTS is the best institution in the world if you are wanting to get that academic education.
Mhm.
So they really still hold by that. That is still an important pillar of what it means to be a student at JTS versus at Hebrew College. I know, for example, I have friends and colleagues who are students there who they wish that the text and academic program is a bit more rigorous. Not to say it is not rigorous in any way, but they wish it was a bit more so. I think the difference between the schools like Hebrew College and AJR and the other ones you mentioned is that to me, these are much more established institutions that have reputable academic backgrounds, whereas Hadar, which they're launching now, they're going to be launching the second cohort of students that they're going to ordain in the next couple of years, but they are, I think, much more of what we would consider to be a traditional yeshiva background,
Mm,
where at Hadar, their program is more or less exclusively devoted to texts. They
mm,
spend basically their entire time learning Talmud, early rabbinic texts, into the halachic texts, and other Bible commentaries, etc. But to the other side of the coin is they don't have a formal program in CPE, so pastoral education. They don't have any requirements for that. Students, if they want to do it, have to go off on their own and do it during a summer break. But they actually don't even get summer breaks, so they have to
oh,
do it.
wow.
It is a full 4 year straight program. They have a couple week breaks.
Wow.
Um, Also at Hadar, they don't have, like at JTS and the other institutions, we have ample opportunities for internships, ample opportunities for like getting jobs to get practical rabbinic experience. Hadar
Mhm,
also does not provide any of that.
mm,
Through Hadar, they do offer the students to be able to teach classes at Hadar and to work with the rabbis in the yeshiva, but they don't have, like at JTS, we have a 4th year proper internship in a synagogue where we spend the entire year working under a rabbi to mentor and to learn what it is to be a rabbi in a synagogue.
mhm, mhm,
Or some people who don't want to go into a pulpit role, they do it, but they do it in a Hillel or in other settings.
mhm,
I think with Hadar, while they have the students who come out of Hadar are true geniuses when it comes to Jewish texts, I think they are lacking a lot of the skills that are necessary for a modern rabbi.
mhm, mhm. Okay, thanks. So we have two people who raised their hands, and I saw that Sean raised his hand first, so go ahead, Sean.
So my question is, has there been any impact at the school or with the leadership really on all everything that's going on at the state of Israel, in Israel and Hamas for the last little bit, and all the negativity that you hear going out there about the Israel leadership at this point? Has that any impact on the relationship at school or the leadership or any impact at all?
Could you say just your question one more time? I don't think I understood.
I
Just
think it's more about the politics, the impact of October 7th on the students, and I think it's like the relationship to the state of Israel and the government.
Yeah, just because I know in the Jewish community, there's some people that are still very much thinking that the Israel government is acting incorrectly and doing the wrong things.
Hmm.
And I didn't know if that had spread to the school you're going to and the seminary and everything, and if there's any impact there.
Yeah, thank you. Uh, I think so. I think especially I was in Israel during the year of the political crisis where there was the judicial overhaul and the try to reform the system. And I think I could, the school JTS, I think, has always been what I would say is more left wing when it comes to the political system of Israel. They always had specific critiques of the system, but work within the system. And I think that that is still what we hold, but it is the line is that we still hold that believe in the Israeli state and where the JTS is a Zionist institution and strongly thinks that we should be actively engaged. For example, with the World Zionist or Congress that we just had the elections for, JTS was very much advertising students to go to their communities to try to get people to vote and to be actively engaged in the system to help preserve a liberal Zionist viewpoint in the Zionist Congress and in turn to have effects on the state of Israel. And so I think that is still very much the standpoint. We have over the past 2 years, JTS has started having a lot of what they call convenings, where they have this thing where people can come in for a couple day specific topic seminar on. And a lot of these topics have been Israel and Zionist focused, talking about what does it mean to be a Zionist in the modern world, talking about what does it mean as Israel to be a democratic and Jewish state. And so we've had a lot of conversations around these topics. I think the war has opened up more conversations about specifically what does it mean JTS within the rabbinical school to have a requirement to study in Israel for students to identify as Zionists. I think the conversations about that have been more specifically within the rabbinical school as opposed to the school as a whole institution.
Lori?
Yeah, I was interested with all the varying perspectives and the varying types of relationships to Judaism, the different backgrounds people come in with, and different political perspectives. I was wondering if there is anything you might say, this may be a little general, but what motivates different people to become rabbis?
Ooh, that is a good question.
Yeah.
I think what underhangs it all, I think there's a lot of reasons why, but I think what really underhangs it all is a desire to serve the Jewish people. I think everyone who comes in some shape or form wants to give something back to the Jewish world. I think for some people it comes much more out of, for myself, for example, I love Torah. I love halacha. I love the system and the traditions and the beliefs we have and how they offer a meaningful way to live life. And I really want to bring that to people. I think for some other people, it's much more less focused on the actual specifics of the tradition and the halachic system and more focused on the relationships of what people have. And I think there's a lot of people who are really, really passionate about the pastoral care aspects of being a rabbi and making sure that what does Judaism offer is it offers a system of community and a way to be with people throughout life, especially in those moments that are more difficult and challenging. I think other people, it's very much about just Jewish community. And for some people, it's like very focused on like, this is a place where I can work with the kids and I went to Hebrew school and I loved my Hebrew school experience. And I want to make sure that those kids have a great Hebrew experience. And then I also had a really good rabbi who taught great classes and I loved interacting with them. And so I wanted to be able to do that. And so I think there's a lot of reasons why people choose to become rabbis, but I think what really does underhang it all is a desire to serve the Jewish people.
So, what kind of jobs have you been applying to?
My
Paul?
hope
Yeah.
My hope is to do pulpit. That's where I feel my calling is. I feel that's where I can do the most help. I really think that pulpit and specific Jewish communities is where the Jews are. The Jews are in the pews, and that's where I should be. And so I've been looking specifically into pulpits. As the search period is coming to an end, I'm starting to expand, possibly taking my first couple of years being in education, maybe with Jewish Hebrew schools or with specific, there's some nonprofits I've been looking at. And so I'm taking a more expanded look now as the search season comes to an end, but my hope is at some point I will land myself in a pulpit more long term.
hmm hmm Um, does anybody else have any questions? Sylvia, go ahead, unmute. That's the screen that says Marvin.
Yeah, I've got it. Today's newspaper, got it this morning, and the front page. Not a traditional merger. Two Jewish temples uniting to form new synagogue. The two different synagogues are in different towns.
Mhm.
I applaud your enthusiasm and I love it. I'm scared. I'm scared of what I read in these papers every day, that less and less people are going to synagogues, less and less people, some are actually turning away from Judaism. Uh, it, I'm afraid of the future for our people.
Mhm.
Just my comment.
Yeah. So, Ariel, do you have an answer to that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be scared of, especially I'm seeing, especially from my side of the being in the rabbinic world, where I can see the synagogues that are looking for rabbis. We're seeing a lot of communities that are really struggling to find rabbis who want to move there, either because it's a community that's, for lack of better terms, in the middle of nowhere, or it's a community that's like really shrinking and starting to approach the end of the life of the synagogue. And it's really sad that I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, which is not a huge Jewish community, but not a tiny, tiny Jewish community. But there are synagogues and where I grew up that they now only have services once a month on Friday night because they just cannot get people out there. And they, thank God, have the resources to keep the building going, but unfortunately, eventually that synagogue will have to close down. And it is really sad to see that. I think one perspective to look at specifically on the mergers that you mentioned with the article, one thing I do appreciate is I do appreciate the chance and the opportunities that merger would provide for those communities to be able to work together now and have I think there's been a lot of discussions about specifically conservative and Reconstructionist synagogues sharing a building together. And I think that they do offer opportunities in which we can have cross-denominational, cross-communal conversations and share kiddush, share meals together, and share opportunities to become closer as a community, even if it is in face of a challenge.
Frida.
Hi, this is a very interesting conversation. Thank you for presenting to us. The question that I have is, I'm curious as to whether, I'm hearing from Sylvia and I'm hearing from you, and we see it and we experience it at our synagogue as well, that, there's, it's challenging. It's challenging to get membership up and things of that sort. And there is, aging community and people, not as interested in coming to. And I'm curious if whether, I mean, I realize that you've been in JTS during the COVID period, right? And so is our synagogue, is Shari Tefillah, for instance, unique in that we offer Zoom services and remote services? And is that something that JTS embraces? Is that something across the board, or is it something that where do you foresee this going to grow the communities? You think maybe it's a matter of, you see families that are now, marrying outside of, Jewish. There's more, intermarriages and things of that sort. And I'm curious as to what you may see, because I can only speak from what we're experiencing at Shari Tefillah. Over.
I think I think Zoom Minion specifically has the pandemic proliferated it. I think a lot of communities now, during the pandemic, took it on as that emergency measure to make sure people could have a minion, but I think a lot of them have kept it. I think, speaking from my experience back in my hometown, my shul used to have a daily in-person minion, but I know for the last couple of years before the pandemic, we started to transition to calling it the daily prayer group because we weren't actually getting a minion. But it was still important to try, and I think the pandemic just gave that push to try something new. So I think a lot of shuls moved to having Zoom minions as a way to ensure that the minion does happen. And a lot of shuls are also working with other conservative synagogues in their local area to have a Zoom minion together as a whole community. And so I think the trend is going to be more and more shuls will be going on to Zoom. At JTS specifically, we do not have Zoom minion, but that's because we do have a large amount of rabbinical students and rabbis on site that we can at least coerce to go to make a minion. But during the pandemic, for example, we did have a Zoom minion at JTS even. Amongst the student body, I think it is one of those topics that's heavily debated. I, for example, hold that a minion cannot be constituted over Zoom, except for the purposes of Mourner's Kaddish. For myself, I think that is the one exception. But I have a lot of classmates who are they think there's no concern whatsoever of having a minion on Zoom. And then I have some classmates who they will not even do anything on Zoom together. And they think that you can pray together, but it is not a minion for any purposes. And so it's a big debate about what's going to happen. But realistically, especially from the job search period of seeing all the synagogue postings who are looking, I would venture to say there is about 50 jobs posted this year, and I would say out of the 50, I would probably venture to say 30 of the synagogues have Zoom minion during the week at least. Most Shabbat, I think, is a distinct exception, whereas I think a lot of schools do live streaming on Shabbat, but not Zoom minion. But there are even still some who do Zoom on Shabbat.
Before there is somebody who wrote in the chat that they have a question. I will get to that in a second. I just want to just also piggyback onto what Ariel was saying. A lot of it also depends on the size of the community and what, based on that size, the community can realistically do in person. And so, in our community, every synagogue is different. Our synagogue, with about 230, 240 families, we're able to have a hybrid minion during the week, in the morning, Sunday, Monday, Thursday, in person and on Zoom. And the only way we've been able to make a minion is to count people on Zoom towards that minion. And that evening, it was always a struggle before COVID to have a minion every night. And now we have minion Monday and Wednesday evenings. plus Friday and Saturday night, and those are Zoom only. So every community also defines for itself based on the community and how they're voting with their feet, literally, like if they're willing to drive for the service to be in person or not during the week. So, the community and the rabbi have different opinions about how to define what the nature of community is and how to make a holy community.
I think another thing on this is I think prior to COVID, I think the conservative movement, especially conservative schools, were very machmir. They tried really
Yes.
hard to have a daily minyan, especially an egalitarian daily minyan. And I think what I'm also seeing out of the pandemic is aside from just Zoom, I think a lot of schools are reevaluating what that might look like. So
Right.
instead of having daily minyan, I've seen a lot of schools go to we have a Sunday minyan, and then they might have one or two other minyans during the week rather than a daily. And I
Right.
think they're finding to prioritize either on Torah days to have minyan or to have like a Wednesday evening minyan to have something in the middle of the week.
Right, right. So Richard, and I don't know if that's Richard or Wendy or who that is.
It's Wendy and Richard. How are you?
Oh, okay, very good.
Ariel, thank you. It's been very interesting. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. So our son is one of those rabbis who is, as you said, in the middle of nowhere, in Omaha, Nebraska,
Mhm.
but has a congregation of close to 600
Mhm.
families, and has daily minyanim.
Twice a day.
Yeah, twice a day.
Mhm.
And so, but I think, it's different in different parts of the country, like in the middle of the country, in a place like Nebraska and Omaha, it's a great, great Jewish community. But if you want to be Jewish, you affiliate with a synagogue.
Mhm.
Whereas in big cities like Washington and Chicago and New York and Boston, people don't really have to go to a synagogue to be with Jewish people. So I think that's one of the tough things, to get to is how do we get people to come to synagogue? Because people, it seems to be more interested in their kids playing softball or soccer or going to ice skating lessons or hockey. And the synagogue costs money, and they'd rather spend the money, sending their kids to do those types of things. So I don't know, you're the next generation, and I hope that you can find a way to bring people in.
Mhm. I think I think to that point, I'm seeing some changes in the movement. I think there's a couple, both membership and membership dues, I think are starting to change. People are trying to experiment with different models instead of having like the categories where you like, are you a full member or are you a partial member or are you a student, etc., where you pay flat due rates. I'm seeing a lot of schools move towards dues either based off of your income or dues based off of free giving. Like my school here in New York City, we're not a conservative school, we're non-affiliated, but our due structure is actually just what you can and will give. And so it is fully individualized and chosen, but we still make our bills. I think other things I'm seeing is a shift in what does it mean to be a synagogue. One synagogue, for example, I saw is they made a shift from being identified as a synagogue to being identified more as a Jewish center or a center for Jewish life, and that they're starting to experiment with what possibilities can a Jewish community be beyond just coming together for prayer and for Torah study, and seeing like can we come together for Jewish just cultural events, having like a class just where we learn Israeli dance rather than learning Torah only. And so I'm seeing some changes in what can a Jewish community look like if it is more expansive than just a synagogue. And so I think there's hope. I think there's ways to look and to be experimental and see what we can do and how these could possibly change. I think especially as these younger generations just have different values and different priorities, I think seeing how the synagogue can follow and evolve with that is a heartening thing to see what the future could look like.
Well, thank you, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you.
So, Ariel, I want to thank you very much for being with us this evening. It's really a pleasure to have had the encounter with you twice this year, to hear the passion in your voice and the intelligence and eloquence in your voice as well. It gives us hope for the future for the conservative movement, and good luck in your job search. And thank you very much for being with us tonight, and thank everyone for being here as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very informative.
Yes, it's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Best of
Thanks so
luck.
much.
Thank you. That was great.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Good night, all.
Good night, everybody. Thank you,
Bye.
Ariel.
Of course. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.